you go back and you look at Microsoft to the extent that that could be a template for this. There was arguably a lost decade for Microsoft, and not just a lost decade in terms of what happened to that stock price, though clearly it's obviously succeeded since then. I think even people inside Microsoft, Bill Gates and possibly Satya and Steve Ballmer, would say that because of the regulation and the lawsuits that were taking place during that period, they took their eye off the ball, and that actually allowed the Apples and the Googles and everybody else to emerge. Do you believe that?
I think there's a very good point there, especially on the second part, which is that it's distracting. But I think what really cost Microsoft the lost decade was not this, but the market shifted. We went through a paradigm shift from PCs driving everything in the 80s and 90s, and that's what built Microsoft, to a shift to the internet and mobile. And for 5 to 10 years, Microsoft missed that shift. It's only been in the last 7 years or so that they've really figured out how to make that transition and done an extraordinary job. So I think what marooned Microsoft stock for a decade was the market, not the antitrust issue. Although
so you don't think the loss, but you know the view. There is a view that Microsoft was so distracted that had they kept their eye on the ball, they would have been in the mobile phone business, for example, and that opened up this whole other opportunity for these competitors.
Microsoft invested a ton in the mobile phone business, and they went after it with the assumption that it would be exactly the same as the PC market, that if you controlled the operating system, you would control everything. They tried that for years with tens of billions of dollars. Turned out it was wrong. That's not what ultimately mattered. And what Apple figured out that a lot of people were skeptical of because of the 1990s was that, in fact, an integrated hardware and software device would be the platform that everybody would build on top of. So I really think the main thing was the market shift. But you're right, it is distracting. And they had to change the culture of the company from kill everybody to at least pretend to be getting along and being fair, which does make a difference.
So if these companies are not going to be broken up, and I'm in agreement, by the way, the question is, how do they get regulated? So let's take Apple, for example. Obviously, big question over the future of what an app store looks like, this quote-unquote 30% Apple tax. How would that change? And how would that change in your mind, therefore, the valuation of the company, if it would at all?
I think this is where Steve's point about the companies really getting embedded in Washington and talking through all these issues is where all of that will be determined. But I think that part of it is just public perception. We instinctively don't like it as people when companies get too powerful and control everything. And I think that is the main generator of all this conversation, because if you look at each one of these markets, actually, there's a lot to support Apple's argument that it doesn't have that much power in the smartphone market. It's only a small piece, et cetera. But public pressure, putting your foot on the throat of an entire industry, the way the App Store percentages do and multiple industries, people instinctively don't like that. They want to open it up. They want to be fairer. So I think a lot of it is public pressure on the companies to do the right thing and to share the wealth a little bit more than they have been.
What company do you think is most at risk?
For immediate regulation, I think each one of them is in a different position. If you look at Google's position in the search market, that's just an extraordinarily powerful position, probably the biggest market share of all of these. And that is a market that I think that you will see antitrust regulators dig into. Facebook,
Henry, how would you remedy the Google situation?
I'm sorry?
To the degree that you might think that the Google search business needs to be quote unquote remedied, how would you do it?
Well, you go back to Microsoft, I think, is another good analogy here. You go back and say, okay, it's way too powerful. Then you've got 5 years of digging into the details, trying to figure out what to do, huge litigation back and forth. In Microsoft's case, they lose. But then they make some changes that forestall big corrections going forward. So, yes, there's the distraction of it. But I think regulators will get in there. They will look at how does Google's search position allow it to get into new markets that are not related to search? How much is it favoring its own business over other businesses? Lots of questions to answer about that. And so they'll dig in, but it's going to be very detailed analysis.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC. on YouTube.